concerned with proposed mining projects, reviews environmental assessments, and advocates for legal reform, and provides critical analysis to media, concerned citizen, and political decision makers. Ramsey is a past board member of PBI, and his interest and concern over mining began with Latin American Solidarity Group. Prior to his move to Ottawa to work with MiningWatch, Ramsey was living on a small farm in New Brunswick, working on contracts for a variety of environmental NGOs, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and Mount Allison University. Ramsey received his Master's in Science and Watershed Ecosystems from Trent University and did his Bachelor's in Environment and Resource Studies at the University of Waterloo. Our next guest speaker is Moira Birss, who has served for the last 3 years as Peace Brigades International Colombia Projects Representative in Washington, D.C., advocating for human rights protection in Colombia. As PBI's only staff in Washington, Moira also represents PBI as a whole in advocacy related to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and represents PBI in the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition. Prior to joining PBI, Moira spent 2 years in Colombia as part of Fellowship of Reconciliation's Colombia Peace Team. Moira graduated with honors from the University of Michigan. So first I want to ask you to say maybe a few words about your experience or what you thought of the movie. We'll start with Ramsey.
My mic on?
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for coming tonight, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to join you and for giving me a little bit of space to say a few words. I'll be very brief because I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. I guess the main message that I take away from those two films is the increasing power that corporations are having over our lives, both here in Canada, but especially in the global south. It can be a bit overwhelming when we think about confronting the corporations and how embedded they are with our government, but I think it's important to keep some historic perspective and recognize that significant social changes have happened. But I think we need to stay focused on corporations and the strangle they hold to have on our governments as one of the key challenges of our time. It's directly linked with climate change, it's directly linked with human rights abuses, and we really need to with laser focus, think about corporations and the increasing power that they are having over our lives and over our governments. And there's a lot that we can do about that, we should be doing about that. There's more responsible sourcing of the things we need in our daily lives. Lush is an interesting example of that. But we need to go well beyond that. We need to make sure that we are ensuring that our governments are responding to us. We need to get the money out of the political system as much as possible. That's not going to happen with our current federal government, so we need to be thinking about some serious change in Ottawa over the next couple of years. And that, I think, is how we can really start to address these issues, because they really are linked. I mean, I could talk a lot about mining and the challenges that we have with mining, but when it comes right down to it, the reason we have challenges with mining is because the corporations are the ones calling the shots, whether it's in Guate, where the repercussions of corporations calling the shots are people being assassinated and displaced, or whether it's in Canada, where we just have environmental laws that are nowhere near what they should be because the corporations don't want them to be. It's the same root cause. So, you know, as you think about what can you do about these situations, there is a lot we can be doing. Welcome to talk about that a bit more in the Q&A. But I think that, you know, obviously the root cause of these conditions is that power we've handed over, or that has been taken from us by these corporations. Thanks, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ramsey. I unmuted it, so we should be able to just talk.
Okay.
Might not be close enough to your mouth.
Does it sound like I'm okay. I'll stay seated. Because actually, I think, no?
Is it SMG?
Do you want to just trade me? Thanks. I think I'll actually just wait for questions. There's a lot of directions I could go talking more about what's happening in Colombia or the way that PBI works, but I'd actually rather hear sort of what your interests are. And so I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Thank you, Moira. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. If you do have a question, we do have a time limit. So raise your hand and Jess will come up with a microphone. And try to specify if you want to ask a question directly to one of the panelists or if you want to ask them as a group. So, anybody has a question? Doesn't look like it, so I'll start. So I guess the first question, I guess, for Ramsey that we thought is, what do you think the courts and judicial system have, the role that they have in corporate accountability and the rights of Indigenous people in sort of ensuring corporate responsibility? And is that a valid path to go?
Yeah, so, hello. Can you hear me? Great. So right now we have a huge gap. We have transnational corporations that operate and can choose where they want to operate, and if conditions aren't to their liking, they can go elsewhere. They can take advantage of very weak governance systems. Countries like Guatemala that have an impunity rate, something that Peace Brigades has worked a lot on, this concept of impunity, where 97% of the crimes committed in Guatemala are never prosecuted. And corporations can take advantage of that reality. And we have no parallel court system that can hold them accountable. And you may have caught it in Graham Russell when he was talking about corporations preferring not to have rules, but preferring voluntary standards and corporate social responsibility. And that's because they want to continue to exploit this lack of international governance over them. So what we need is probably an international court to deal with transnationals. In the meantime, however, we should be using all of the means available to hold these companies to account. And one way we could do that is to make sure that individuals and communities that are impacted by our corporations can seek redress in our court systems. It's not, our court systems aren't perfect, but they're a heck of a lot better track record than places like Guatemala. And so there have been some very pioneering efforts to bring issues, particularly around mining and violence associated with Canadian mining companies, to Canadian courts. But there's been a number of barriers to that. And typically the companies will successfully argue that the case ought not be heard in Canada. It would be best heard in the country where the incident occurred. So MiningWatch, as well as other partners, are working on a campaign. It's called Open for Justice. And one big part of that is trying to ensure that there's a change in legislation to make it very clear that, yes, Canadian courts are open to hear complaints from people harmed by Canadian corporations internationally.
Thank you.
Do you want to ask anyone if you want to ask questions?
Does anyone have questions again? Nope. So our next question will be for Moira. What do PBI volunteers do on a daily basis in Colombia, and what difference does this make for human rights defenders and their families?
Well, the work that PBI does in Colombia, and this is true in all the countries where we work, is a combination of the physical presence in the field. You saw a little bit of that in the video about the peace community, where we're actually in the community with our shirts with the logos on the back being really visible. And the idea of that is it's a very visible reminder to the actors in the area that the international community is paying attention to what happens to those communities and to those human rights activists that we're working to protect. But that's also accompanied by something that's much more behind the scenes, but equally as important, and that's political pressure, right? So regular meetings with government officials, with military officials on the local level and at the national level, and with embassies and with the UN and with the Red Cross and actors who have any sorts of sway over what happens in a country, and so generating attention and pressure to obligate governments to protect human rights activists and to improve conditions for human rights in those countries. So on a day-to-day basis, that can mean a variety of things. It means reading the news every day and making sure you know what's going on in a country in the region where you're working. It means preparing a meeting with the general in charge of the local army brigade. And then going to have that meeting. It means writing reports on that meeting. It means going, maybe say, with a lawyer who represents victims of human rights abuses, going with them to a hearing in which a high-ranking military official is being accused of ordering a massacre, say. It might mean internal meetings, doing administrative stuff in the office. It might mean going on a trip to San Jose de Apartado and visiting one of their outlying community settlements. That might take 8 hours hiking in the mud in the mountains, which is in the jungle region, which is pretty treacherous. Let me tell you, I've done it treacherous in the sense that you might get stuck in a mud pit kind of way. So it can be it's a whole variety of things, and it's sort of never the same every day. And the way that really the way that affects the human rights offenders and their families is it helps keep them safe. I think sometimes when people hear about PBI and the idea of productive accompaniment, they imagine this idea of a human shield, and that's not what we do, right? It's much more about using political pressure and using the attention of the international community to keep people safe. But it does work. And you heard Jesus Emilio, the peace community leader with the hat on, talking about the way that it's kept them safe. And I've spent a lot of time in the peace community, and leaders like Jesus Emilio and Brigades always say, if it wasn't for you guys, we wouldn't be here. We'd just be as a place to be here. We've been killed. And so that's how we can measure our impact.
Thank you. And I guess if you have any questions, so I guess I'll go there first. Hopefully that might work.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for being here. I have a question specifically for MiningWatch. I was really surprised to see that community members in these mining villages in Guatemala, some of them were pro-mining. So I find that really baffling, considering they're seeing the impacts that these mining companies are having in their communities. So I was just wondering, is MiningWatch doing anything to inform the communities of what are the long-term effects of these mining companies? I know that some of them do come in with, on the basis of humanitarian assistance, they'll set up schools, clinics, trying to get people on their side. But those are only short-term, I guess, rewards, but long-term effects are very harmful. So I was just wondering if MiningWatch is doing anything to inform the public at large of these harmful effects.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And in the South, what we mostly do that through is by facilitating exchanges between communities with experience with mining and those that may have proposed projects in their area. And so linking up, much of the opposition to the mining in Guatemala has come from community people visiting Honduras, where Goldcorp was operating previously, and seeing with their own eyes and talking to people there about their experience, and then saying, well, geez, that doesn't sound too positive. So we're going to try and impose this back home. And we do the same thing in Canada, raising awareness about the real issues and long-term, especially the long-term issues with these very large mining operations. But in Canada and in the global South, people have different values, they have different perspectives, and so you have a situation where people come out with the same information and they come to different conclusions. Once you are working at a mine, it becomes difficult to then walk away from that if you become dependent on the salary. There are people that are more interested in the cash in the short term than they are in concerns about downstream water quality or have immediate needs that they have to fulfill. So we can't expect any community to be completely of one mind about these things. But the mining companies also know how to work that situation and how to, sometimes in very open ways and sometimes in very subtle and sometimes in illegal ways through bribery and other mechanisms that we've got documented that Canadian mining companies use, will exploit the divisions within communities and try to wedge themselves in. So it is a big part of what we do, but it's a big challenge. And at the end of the day, there will be differences of opinion about these projects.
Me?
Also about mining, in your opinion, is it at all reasonable to attempt to compromise in terms of saying, okay, this international corporation is going to mine in this country for this particular mineral, but try to get them to do so in a more responsible way? Is that at all something you look at or consider?
Yeah, absolutely, both internationally and within Canada. My work at MiningWatch now, though it started on mining issues in Latin America, my work is mostly Canadian-based now, but my coworkers work in Latin America and Africa and Asia. So absolutely, there are opportunities to have mining projects where communities may receive some benefits from them, where the environment is protected to the greatest extent possible, and where there is room for mining to happen. In Central America and Mesoamerica, it's very hard to imagine fitting a project of this scale anywhere without having really significant impacts because the population density is so high and because people are so dependent on the land base for their livelihoods. But there are other regions or there are other circumstances where mining can happen. And, I mean, as much as I hate to contradict Noam Chomsky, he says, we can't really mine, we shouldn't be mining. It's not really a realistic possibility. We could live without gold mining, absolutely. We could live without diamond mining, absolutely. But for the next little while, at least, there's going to have to be some mining somewhere. And so we need to figure out where that can happen, and we need to do a much better job making the local people not just bear the burden of the environmental problems and the dislocation. We need to do a better job of making mining fit in better and figuring out where it can go. And one of the key issues behind that is ensuring that the affected communities have the power to give or withhold their consent for mining projects. And James Anaya was featured quite prominently in the Gold Fever movie, has been a big proponent for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the need for corporations to achieve the free, prior, and informed consent before projects like that move forward.
Thanks for the question. Who is?
Is it on?
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the new seed regulations in Colombia. From what we saw in the documentary, the farmers are also put into a disadvantage, especially the ones that are small growers. And here in Canada and the United States, and internationally through Europe, we know the fair trade movement has been getting more and more awareness. For those who don't know, it's mainly focused on empowerment of small farmers. I was wondering if in Colombia, for farmers that have been put into a disadvantage, there is some bigger organization that they can be a part of where the products that they're selling or everything, or how they can be more protected against Monsanto's, and ensuring that us on the other side of the world knows how to support them.
I can try to answer some of that question. This is not my area of expertise, but well, I mean, as the documentary made clear, the prohibition of seed saving is across the board now, and so even if something were, in a community were trying to do fair trade production, those rules would still apply to them. And so, however, there are organizations that are supporting communities in doing fair trade production. Of course, it would have to fall within the regulations that are stipulated that were mentioned here in the film. And there are some organizations that do fair trade certification, that are sort of applicable to markets here in the U.S. and in Europe. And of course, the Lush example is one where a company is directly working with a community to export their. So in the case of the peace community, it's their cocoa beans, right? And so they have actually Lush has worked with the peace community to not only just buy the beans and ship them from the port of Cartagena, but also to help them get them from the community, in their remote area and then actually, take it to the port and package it and everything. And so, and particularly in a region like Ottawa where the peace community is located, that's a really important help because it's still a conflict zone, and so there are a lot of sort of barriers to communities themselves having access to to the shipping containers and all those things. So so that's a model that can be useful too. But again, the regulations on saving seed and stuff are there are no loopholes.
I can't speak to the specifics of it, but I think it for me, your question is a really good one, and it points out the fundamental weakness of sort of the consumer approach to dealing with these issues. That as an individual, I do have a certain power. We like to emphasize that power as your power to change the world by buying the right running shoe, or your power to change the world by buying the right cup of coffee. And that can have an impact, but at the same time, we're confronting a very incestuous relationship between transnational corporations and our governments. And they're creating the rules of the game. And so no matter how much fair trade coffee we buy, or no matter how much organic rice we try and buy, as long as the corporations and the governments are in lockstep creating the rules of the game, we're going to be extremely limited in the reach and the impact that those sort of individual choices that we make are.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question.
Hi. My question is for Moira about in the second film, somebody made a comment about how the United States and other currently more developed countries didn't use free trade as a development policy while they were at the stage that Colombia is at. So I was just curious as to your opinions of free trade as a development policy, and whether you think that trade agreements between richer and poorer nations is inherently damaging, or whether it can be beneficial depending on the conditions.
I appreciate Jeff and question at me, but I can't actually answer that because PBI doesn't have a position on that, and so perhaps Ramsey has more liberty to speak on such things than I will as the PBI.
Awesome thing about working for MiningWatch is I get to say whatever I want. I mean, I'm not an expert in trade policy, and college is my background, but by working on global environmental issues and local environmental issues, we do run up against free trade policies all the time. I can't unequivocally say that a free trade agreement has never helped, a country achieve development objectives. There probably are some examples somewhere, but the vast weight of evidence around free trade is negative outcomes in terms of equity and in terms of improving things other than the big economic indicators like GDP and exports, which may look nice on paper, but when it comes down to it, have very little to do with people doing better and with a society that's more egalitarian and more just. So it tends to enhance inequalities, and some people may be doing better under those systems, but not the majority. That film focused on the US, but Canada is aggressively pursuing free trade agreements. There was South Korea was in the news most recently, but prior to that, places like Honduras, Colombia have been real focus, and no surprise, that's also where Canadian mining companies have major interests, and the so-called free trade agreements end up having a lot more to do with investor protection than they do ensuring fairness or equity between trading partners. And so we see things facilitated like we have in both El Salvador and Costa Rica, Canadian mining companies that are suing the governments, the national governments of those two countries, because they refused to approve mining projects, largely based on the opposition those projects had by local people. And so they're using not necessarily free trade agreements, but investor protection agreements, sort of the big package of international trade agreements, to sue those host countries because they said no to mining. So that's generally the way they go.
Thank you.
And I guess one last question that I think that can apply to everybody that came. What can each of you sort of say a little thing? What can each of us do as sort of Canadians to take action in these problems and sort of address sort of the problems we've seen in Goldpaper and 9.70?
There's definitely a lot we can be doing, a lot we should be doing to confront these issues, and I think the actions we can take can and should be on a spectrum from small individual acts like buying fair trade, like trying to find ways of investing your money that doesn't involve putting it in the stock market. So once many of you are students, once you're actually making some money, investing in something like the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op rather than in stocks and bonds, because you can't really invest, unless you're buying individual stocks and bonds, you can't invest in mutual funds or any of that other stuff without being involved with these big corporations. I thought I had a good ethical fund that my one advisor told me to buy, and then another advisor said, "Why are you in that one?" And I said, "Well, I have some ethical things that I asked about." He said, "Well, look at who's actually in there." And I looked at the fine print, and I remember one holding was Monsanto. Thanks. So anyway, looking at alternative ways of managing our money and funneling it into local initiatives is one really exciting opportunity. And then we need to be political. We need to get re-engaged in our democratic processes. We need to pressure our politicians. We need to have a greater diversity of people becoming politicians to reinvigorate our democracies.
Definitely agree with all that Ramsey has said, and I just want to add to that I think there are opportunities for work that we all can do at the local level, and there are also opportunities that we can do at the international level, and that's part of where PBI comes in. And as the folks that are doing the on-the-ground work of the accompaniment are internationals, are people from the US and from Canada and from Europe who decide to go and spend a year or a couple of years or more supporting these human rights activists, these really courageous communities, human rights lawyers who are doing this kind of work and who are therefore challenging the status quo in their countries, and also because we're taking our access to our governments and the political process here, we're taking that sort of power with us when we go. We're helping influence what our own countries are doing, and so I'll just to give a little plug for those of you who might think about joining with PBI and doing the kind of work that we do. And there's lots of information about that outside of the table, and you can also talk to me or any of the other folks about that.
Thank you. So let's give a hand for our amazing panelists. We have a small gift for you guys. Oh, good one. Thank you. If you have any more questions that we didn't have time for, you can come up to either me or Cheyenne or any of the PBI staff or guest speakers. And I guess we have a few things we wanted to say before you guys start.
Yeah, so first of all, we just wanted to thank all of our colleagues at PBI. Thank you to Sarah Jane and Toshio and Kelly for all the amazing work you guys do at PBI and for letting us get involved. And then we also wanted to thank all of the awesome volunteers for helping us out, not only tonight, but since the beginning of January.
Yeah, I guess that's it. We also want to thank Lush. We almost forgot Lush. For supporting the festival and for all the great work they've done with the peace community. It's been really great. And so I guess we hope you have a great night.
And thank you guys for coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah.